Sam has such an enormous line of credits behind his name that we'd be here half the night just reading them all. So we'd like to introduce that very noted author, Mr. Sam Blumenfeld.
I want to welcome all of you to our wonderful Boston area, New England. You know, this is where it all started, you know, in New England with the Pilgrims and the Puritans and all of that. So hopefully we can get it started again here. Before I begin my speech...
We can't hear you back here.
Oh, well, that's right, hold your ears and turn up your hearing aids, and we'll do the best we can, but I have limited voice power. I'm 83, what do you expect? Anyway, before I begin my speech, I did want to pay tribute to Alan Stang, as you know, an old friend who died earlier this week. And as some of you know, Alan joined the Society back in the 1960s and became one of Bob Welch's favorite writers. You know, he was a tireless, incredibly articulate anti-communist and knew how the conspiracy works. And then, of course, in his later years, he sort of wandered off and wrote a lot of things that I think most of us would disagree with. But in any case, he and his wife, Gail, have left a great legacy of 5 patriotic, homeschooled children who will carry on the work of their father well into the future. Well, anyway, I'm delighted to have this opportunity to speak to the most dedicated group of patriots in America, and that's what you all are. Just when my newest book, Revolution via Education, has been published, once in a while, the right book comes out at the right time, and I hope all of you will buy it and read it and bring it to the attention of your friends and relatives, because we certainly are seeing the revolution take place right before our eyes. There is no question that the revolutionary left has triumphed in a way that many of us never thought could happen. What we didn't realize is that while our conservative principles were being undermined by misguided Republicans in the White House and Congress, the left had lost none of its intention of imposing on America its radical socialist agenda. And the main reason why they were able to succeed is that for the last 75 years, they have been in total control of American public education, which gave them the means to produce a whole new generation of dumbed-down Americans who don't know the difference between capitalism and socialism, freedom and tyranny. I have been writing about the leftist takeover of the public schools since 1973, when my first book, How to Start Your Own Private School, was published. In that book, I wrote, quote, "The myth of public education as the greatest good ever invented is dying a slow, painful, agonizing death, one that may drag on for quite a while, contaminating and corrupting all of those who must remain with it until the very end. The state has proven once again that unbridled governmental power, as in public education, knows no limits in how absurd, perverted, and misguided it can be," unquote. Prophetic words in 1973, and the only people who took them seriously were Birchers. They understood that the public schools could not be reformed as long as the left maintained its stranglehold. As a result, they began what has become the great American homeschool movement, an exodus by now of about 2 million children. Recently, I was totally surprised by something on YouTube. Someone posted a speech I gave in Stockton, California, back in the 1980s. It was one of the many speeches I gave in those days all over the country, sponsored by JBS. And I am sure that some of the parents in that audience removed their children from the public schools after they heard what I had to say. I minced no words in those days, and I don't mince them today. My second book, The New Illiterates, published in 1972, was about the reading problem. I had read Rudolf Flesch's book, Why Johnny Can't Read, back in the 1960s, and decided that an updating was needed. Flesch's book was published in 1955, and we still had a reading problem in 1972. In fact, we still have it 54 years later. In November 2007, the National Endowment for the Arts issued a devastating report on American literacy entitled Reading at Risk. The chairman of the endowment, Dana Gioia, stated, quote, "This is a massive social problem. We are losing the majority of the new generation. They will not achieve anything close to their potential because of poor reading," unquote. And this was said just 2 years ago. But Flesch told us in 1955 exactly why we had this problem. He wrote, quote, "The teaching of reading all over the United States in all the schools and all of the textbooks is totally wrong and flies in the face of all logic and common sense," unquote. I wanted to find out why our educators decided to get rid of phonics, the proper way to teach reading, and put in its place a whole word method that teaches children to read English as if it were Chinese, an ideographic system. I had been taught to read by phonics in the public schools of New York City in the 1930s, and I could not imagine how anyone in his right mind would try to teach any child to read without it. But what I discovered was mind-boggling. I did a line-by-line analysis of the Dick and Jane reading program being used in almost all of the schools of America and came to the startling conclusion that any child taught to read by that method alone would exhibit the symptoms of dyslexia. They would become lifelong reading cripples, and this was being done to them deliberately. Indeed, the educators had been warned by neuropathologist Samuel T. Orton in 1929 that this sight method of teaching reading would cause untold harm to large number of students. I also made another shocking discovery when writing that book. I discovered that the inventor of the whole word method was none other than the Reverend Thomas H. Gallaudet, the teacher of the deaf and dumb. Because the deaf could not hear language, he created a sight method whereby the deaf would learn to read by associating words with pictures. By this method, the deaf could acquire a limited reading vocabulary. Gallaudet then thought that this method might also work with normal children. So he wrote a primer based on this method, which was adopted by the Boston primary schools in 1837. It produced a reading disaster, and the Boston schools quickly went back to traditional alphabetic phonics. But the progressive educators, knowing full well why the method did not work in 1837, revived it for the schools of the 20th century. Why? Because John Dewey and his socialist colleagues believed that high literacy was an obstacle to socialism. High literacy, you see, promoted individual intellectual independence. What was needed was a lower level of literacy fit for a collectivized proletariat with stifled brains. In other words, thanks to the progressives, school-induced reading disability has become a fact of life in modern America. Knowing all of this, I decided in 1983 to produce an intensive phonics reading program that any parent could use to teach their children to read at home. It is called Alpha Phonics, and has been used by thousands of homeschoolers to teach their children to read. Incidentally, I have some copies of it here in case any of you would like to get a copy. If the schools of America would adopt that program, all of our reading problems would vanish in short order. But trying to get intensive phonics in the public schools is like hitting your head against a stone wall. And believe you me, I have tried to get the book into the public schools. They won't have it. I then wanted to find out why freedom-loving Americans adopted government education so early in their history. The result was a book that has become a classic, Is Public Education Necessary? In that book, I revealed that the government school movement had been started by the Harvard Unitarians who wanted to get Calvinism out of the schools. Their solution was to create government-owned and operated secular schools which would teach a humanistic kind of religion. They were then joined by the Owenite socialists, who also advocated a government school system wherein children could be trained to become little communists. As a matter of fact, Robert Owen set up his communist colony at New Harmony, Indiana. It's a lovely place to visit. And finally, they were joined by the evangelical Protestants who were alarmed at the increased rate of Catholic migration to America and decided that a government school system controlled by Protestants is what was needed to proselytize Catholic children. The Catholics, of course, were aware of this and created their own parochial system to educate their own children. But it was the atheistic Owenites who were the most determined to get the children away from religion. One of the men attracted to the Owenite movement was Orestes Brownson, a writer and editor whose remarkable religious odyssey took him from Calvinism to Universalism to socialism to Unitarianism and finally to Catholicism. Years later, describing his short experience with the Owenites, he wrote, quote, "But the more immediate work was to get our system of schools adopted. To this end, it was proposed to organize the whole Union secretly, very much on the plan of the Carbonari of Europe, of whom at that time I knew nothing." Incidentally, the Carbonari were an offshoot of the Illuminati. The members of this secret society were to avail themselves of all the means in their power, each in their own locality, to form public opinion in favor of education by the state at the public expense, and to get such men elected to the legislatures as would likely be favorable to our purposes. How far the secret organization extended, I do not know, but I do know that a considerable portion of the state of New York was organized, for I was myself one of the agents for organizing it, unquote. And so we know that as early as 1829, the socialists had adopted covert techniques to further their ends in the United States, techniques that they have continued to use right up to the present. Is it any wonder that they finally won the White House and Congress? Government monopoly education, controlled by the socialists, is destroying our freedom and economy. It is destroying the literacy of our children, destroying their religion and morality. The American brain is being dumbed down at an alarming rate. And when you see the once mighty General Motors down on its knees, transformed into a government-owned dwarf, you know that the America we grew up in no longer exists. And who knows what will become of the once mighty dollar with trillion-dollar deficits. But never underestimate the power of America to reassert its basic love of individual freedom. One of the good things to come out of the last election was the creation of the Campaign for Liberty, started by Ron Paul and those millions of young Americans who voted for him and want to bring constitutional government back to America. This is a campaign that Birchers can wholeheartedly support. But make no mistake about it. The only real solution to the education problem is to get the government out of it. And the fastest way to do that is to get the children out of the government schools. That is why I want to get Is Public Education Necessary and NEA, Trojan Horse in American Education, back into print. All of those eager young members of the Campaign for Liberty must realize that we have to get the government out of the education business for one very simple reason. Government monopoly education is totally incompatible with the principles of a free society. We all know that monopolies are bad. But an educational monopoly is particularly bad because it must rely on government force for its existence. Property owners are forced to pay taxes to pay for the local school system, regardless of whether or not they use it. Monopolies do not reflect market values because the consumer must pay whatever prices they charge. And they create among millions of educators a vested interest in maintaining and expanding this huge river of taxpayer cash flow, and it's larger than even the Defense Department. Above all, monopolies attract lovers of power rather than lovers of efficiency. They also create artificial values, such as multiculturalism and affirmative action, which the consumer must pay for. And of course, they hate educational freedom and would like nothing better than to shut down homeschoolers. All attempts to reform the system have resulted in even greater failure. But what may be failure to us is success to them. For example, the billions of dollars the federal government has poured into compensatory education, Title I, since 1965, has resulted in lower SAT scores and more illiteracy, not less. But it has also created thousands of Title I teachers who need continued educational failure to justify their jobs. The only solution that makes sense is to privatize the entire system. Each public school could easily become a private institution run by a local board of trustees, financed by tuitions and whatever other private means the schools can conceive of. Since the local community would be relieved of paying for the schools, the tuitions of poor children could be paid by a town foundation set up for that purpose. Privatization would lower property taxes so that taxpayers could use their money in more productive ways. The cost of education would decline dramatically by eliminating the unionized bureaucracies that now govern state and town systems. Free competition among schools would force them to end the dumbing down process and strive for real intellectual development. Privatization would eliminate the cultural and religious conflicts that now plague the schools. It would also open a whole new field for free enterprise, taking advantage of all the great technological advances of the last 50 years. It would also improve the lives of children by making them literate and safeguarding their moral and spiritual well-being. But most of all, privatization would represent a sharp rebuke to the philosophy of statism and therefore depoliticize education. The most compelling reason why we must get the children out is because public education has become a criminal enterprise. Deliberately dumbing down our children is a crime. Performing non-surgical prefrontal lobotomies on our kids is a crime. Our educators are also guilty of drug pushing, forcing 6 million children to take powerful, mind-altering drugs as so-called cures for ADD and ADHD. Some of these drugs, taken over several years, have actually led to the sudden death of some teenagers on the playing fields. The reason? Some of these drugs contract blood flow to the heart and cause cardiac arrest. Another criminal activity which contributes to the delinquency of minors is exposing children from kindergarten onward to sexual perversion in the name of lifestyle diversity. That certainly is a form of moral child molestation. The schools also deliberately undermine the religious beliefs of the students, destroying their belief in biblical morality. I could go on and on making my case, but you and I know that the solution is simple. Get the government out of education. Of course it won't be easy. Our government in Washington has been hijacked by these socialist retrogrades who are out to destroy everything that has made America the greatest, freest, and richest nation on earth. How could this be? How could this happen? What is God trying to tell us? It became clear to me that the only sure way to stop this wholesale theft of our future is to get American children out of the hands of government schooling. There is a national organization, the Separation of School and State Alliance, founded by the late Marshall Fritz, that ought to have the support of everyone here. This must become part of the campaign for liberty, part of this growing crusade to restore constitutional government, economic and educational freedom to our beloved country. Thank you very much.